Jake Morrison had been running the last stop for almost 8 years now. It was a small bar tucked away in the corner of New Denver Station, one of those places that most people walked past without giving it a second glance. The paint on the walls was chipping, the chairs were mismatched, and the neon sign outside flickered every few seconds. But Jake loved it. This was his little corner of the galaxy, and he took pride in every scratched table and worn bar stool. Tonight was a Tuesday, which meant it was slow. Real slow. Jake had maybe 6 customers spread across the whole place. There was old Pete sitting in his usual corner booth, nursing the same beer he'd been working on for an hour. A couple of Vrelnari traders were arguing quietly at a table near the window, their tentacles gesturing wildly as they debated whatever it was traders debated. And sitting at the bar was a young human couple who looked like they were on their first date, all nervous smiles and awkward pauses. Jake was wiping down the counter for the 3rd time that hour when the front door swung open. The metal hinges creaked loudly, making everyone in the bar look up. What walked through that door made Jake stop mid-wipe. The creature had to duck down just to fit through the doorway, even though Jake had installed taller doors specifically to accommodate the bigger alien species that passed through the station. This being was massive. Had to be at least 9 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in scales that shimmered between deep purple and midnight blue, catching the dim bar lights and making them dance across its skin like oil on water. 2 enormous wings were folded tight against its back, and a pair of curved horns swept back from its skull. Golden eyes, bright and intense, scanned the room with an expression that Jake couldn't quite read. A Draken. Jake had only ever seen them in pictures and videos. They were rare out here, kept mostly to their own territories way out in the scorched rim. Seeing one in person was like spotting a celebrity, except this celebrity could probably tear through a steel wall with its bare hands. The young couple at the bar quickly paid their tab and left, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. The Vrelnari traders suddenly found their conversation much more interesting, refusing to look up. Old Pete just raised his beer in greeting and went back to staring at nothing in particular. That guy had seen everything in his 70 years of space travel and nothing impressed him anymore. The Draken moved slowly through the bar, each step deliberate and careful, like it was trying not to break anything. It made its way to the far end of the counter, the darkest corner of the room, and carefully lowered itself onto a reinforced stool that creaked under its weight. Jake grabbed his towel and walked over. Up close, the creature was even more impressive. Those scales had tiny patterns etched into them, almost like someone had carved artwork into every single one. The horns looked like polished obsidian. But what really caught Jake's attention were the eyes. They looked tired. More than tired. They looked sad. "What can I get you?" Jake asked, keeping his voice friendly and casual. The Draken blinked like it was surprised to be spoken to. I'm not certain. What do you recommend for someone who wishes to forget for a while?" The voice was deep, rumbling, but there was something gentle in it. Something wounded. Jake had been a bartender long enough to recognize that tone. This wasn't someone looking to cause trouble or show off. This was someone who was carrying something heavy and needed a place to set it down for a minute. "Well, that depends on what you're trying to forget," Jake said, pulling out a clean glass. "Bad day at work? Relationship troubles? Or just general existential dread about the meaninglessness of existence in an infinite universe?" The corner of the Draken's mouth twitched upward just slightly. "Perhaps all 3. Jake nodded knowingly. "Yeah, I get that. Tell you what, I've got something special I save for occasions like this." He reached under the counter and pulled out a bottle of amber liquid. It was pre-Exodus Earth whiskey, the real deal, not the synthetic garbage most places served. Jake had been saving it for something special, though he wasn't sure what. This felt right though. He poured 2 fingers into the glass and slid it across the counter. "On the house. You look like you could use it." The Draken stared at the glass like Jake had just handed it a bar of solid gold. You are giving this to me? For free? You do not even know who I am." "Don't need to know who you are," Jake shrugged, going back to cleaning glasses. "I know a rough day when I see one. We all have them. Species doesn't matter when it comes to needing a drink and some peace and quiet." Those golden eyes studied Jake for a long moment, like the Draken was trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick. Finally, it lifted the glass with surprising delicacy, considering those claws could probably crush steel. It took a small sip, then its eyes widened. "This is exceptional. I have not tasted anything like this in..." The Draken trailed off, staring into the glass like it held answers to questions it hadn't asked yet. "Pre-Exodus Earth Reserve," Jake said with a bit of pride. "Probably older than both of us combined. Well, older than me anyway. Not sure how old you folks get." 347 years, the Draken said quietly. I have walked this universe for 347 years. Jake let out a low whistle. Damn. That's a lot of birthdays. Must have seen some things. Too many things. So many that sometimes I cannot remember why any of it matters anymore. The Draken took another sip, savoring it. My name is Vec. Jake Morrison. Nice to meet you, Vec. You traveling through or staying on the station for a while? Traveling. Always traveling. It is easier to keep moving than to stay in one place. Vec's voice carried a weight that spoke of more than just physical travel. They talked for the next 2 hours. Not about anything important or heavy. Just simple stuff. Jake told stories about the weird customers he'd had over the years, like the robot who got drunk on premium motor oil and tried to sing opera, or the time a telepathic alien accidentally broadcast its dreams to everyone in the bar. Vec listened and occasionally shared small observations about different worlds, beautiful nebulas it had seen, strange creatures that lived in the dark spaces between stars. What Vec didn't mention was the crown. The empire. The 1700 worlds that bowed when it spoke. The title of emperor that it carried like chains. For 2 blessed hours, Vec was just another customer at a quiet bar, talking to a friendly bartender about nothing in particular. When the station's artificial night cycle started winding down and Jake announced last call, Vec stood slowly. It reached out with one massive clawed hand and gently took Jake's hand in both of its own. Thank you, Jake Morrison. You have given me something tonight that I have not had in longer than I can remember. You treated me like a person. Just a person. Jake smiled. That's because you are a person, Vec. Big fancy scales and wings don't change that. You're always welcome here if you pass through again. Vec's eyes seemed to shimmer slightly, like tears might form if Draken could cry. It nodded once, released Jake's hand and walked toward the door. Before leaving, it turned back. If circumstances were different, I believe we could have been good friends. Hey, who says we aren't? Jake called after it. Vec smiled, truly smiled, and then disappeared into the station's corridors. Jake cleaned up the bar, humming to himself. It had been a good night. Sometimes the best nights weren't the busy ones or the profitable ones. Sometimes the best nights were when you helped someone feel a little less alone in a big, cold universe. The next morning, Jake found a small credit chip on the bar where Vec had been sitting. He almost threw it away thinking it was trash, but something made him check it first. The number that appeared on his scanner made his knees weak. It was enough money to buy the entire station. Maybe 2 stations. There was a message attached in elegant script that definitely hadn't been written by any human. For the whiskey and for reminding me what kindness feels like. With deepest gratitude, Vec. Jake stood there for a long time staring at that number. He had no idea that his lonely customer had been the emperor of the most powerful civilization in 3 galactic arms. He had no idea that one simple act of kindness had just changed his life forever. And he definitely had no idea that in 3 weeks, armed soldiers would kick down his door looking for the man who had befriended an emperor. But for now, in this quiet morning moment, Jake just smiled and tucked the chip into his pocket. Sometimes you did good things for people just because it was the right thing to do. The fact that it came back to you was just the universe's way of saying thank you. He had no idea how much the universe was about to thank him, or how complicated that gratitude would become. 3 weeks had passed since that strange night with Vec, and Jake had almost convinced himself it had been some kind of fever dream. The credit chip sat untouched in his safe. It felt wrong to spend money just for being decent to someone. His mama had raised him better than that. Business at the last stop had actually picked up a bit. Word had spread that Jake served real earth whiskey, and apparently that was rare enough out here to draw a curious crowd. On this particular evening, Jake had a decent group going. About 15 customers scattered around, laughing, drinking, sharing stories. It was the kind of night that made Jake remember why he loved this job. He was in the middle of pouring a beer for a Koth merchant when the front door slammed open hard enough to crack the frame. The music stopped. Every conversation died mid-sentence. That kind of entrance never meant anything good. 6 figures marched into the bar like they owned the place. 4 of them were Koth warriors and not the friendly merchant kind. These guys were built like tanks, wearing black combat armor that looked like it could stop a missile. Their hands rested casually on weapons that could probably vaporize half the bar. But it was the other 2 that made Jake's stomach drop. They wore the silver and blue uniforms of Galactic Authority enforcers. Jake had seen enough crime dramas to know that enforcers only showed up when someone was in serious trouble. The kind of trouble that ended with you disappearing into some prison colony on the other side of the galaxy. The lead enforcer was tall and thin, with pale blue skin and eyes that looked like chips of ice. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing everyone in the room was afraid of him. His partner was shorter but wider, built like a bulldog with scars crossing his gray face. Every customer in the bar suddenly found reasons to leave. They threw credits on tables, mumbled excuses, and hurried out past the enforcers. Within 60 seconds, Jake was alone with 6 very dangerous-looking individuals. Even old Pete had vanished, and that guy usually stayed through fights. The lead enforcer walked up to the bar and pulled out a holographic badge. Jake Morrison, human, age 34, proprietor of this establishment? Jake's mouth went dry, but he kept his voice steady. That's me. What can I do for you gentlemen? You can come with us for questioning. 3 weeks ago, you had contact with a fugitive of extreme interest to the Galactic Authority. The individual known as Vec. Jake's mind raced. Fugitive? Vec had seemed sad and lonely, not dangerous. I serve a lot of customers. Can't say I remember everyone who comes through. The enforcer's cold smile didn't reach his eyes. Don't play stupid, human. We have surveillance footage of you spending 2 hours in conversation with the target. We have financial records showing an unusual credit transfer to your account the following morning. We know you met with Vec and we need to know everything you discussed. One of the Koth warriors stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. The sound was like rocks grinding together. This can go easy or hard, bartender. Your choice. Jake felt anger bubbling up alongside the fear. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd served a customer a drink and had a conversation. That was his job. Look, I don't know what you think happened, but I just poured the guy a whiskey and we talked about nothing important. I didn't know he was anyone special. That's precisely the problem, the lead enforcer said. You provided aid and comfort to a person of interest without performing proper identity verification. That's a violation of Station Security Code 17-4. You're coming with us for a full interrogation. If you cooperate, this will go smoothly. If you resist. He let the threat hang in the air. Jake's hands tightened into fists. He'd heard stories about Galactic Authority interrogations. People went in and came out different. Sometimes they didn't come out at all. I want to contact a lawyer first. The bulldog enforcer laughed, a harsh barking sound. Lawyers are for citizens with rights, human. You're a suspect in a matter of galactic security. You have no rights until we say you do. That's when Jake knew he was in real trouble. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to make him disappear. The lead enforcer nodded to the Koth warriors. Secure him. Use force if necessary. 2 of the warriors moved around the bar, their heavy boots thudding on the floor. Jake looked around desperately for an escape route, but there wasn't one. The back door was too far. His emergency comm was under the counter, but what good would calling station security do? These guys were the authority. One warrior reached for Jake's arm. Come quietly, human, and maybe we don't break anything. Jake jerked away. Get your hands off me. I haven't done anything wrong. Resisting detention, the enforcer said calmly, like he was checking off a box. Add that to the charges. The warrior grabbed Jake's shoulder hard enough to make him wince. The second warrior moved to grab his other arm. Jake struggled, but what was he going to do against 2 guys who probably benched press small vehicles for fun? Then the west wall of his bar exploded. Not metaphorically. Not like someone kicked through drywall. The entire reinforced Durasteel wall, the one that was supposed to withstand small arms fire and decompression events, just ceased to exist. It turned into a cloud of molten metal and vaporized debris that washed over the room in a wave of superheated air. Jake hit the floor behind the bar, covering his head as chunks of ceiling rained down. The enforcers and Koth warriors stumbled backward, raising their arms against the blast. Through the smoke and dust walked figures that looked like they'd stepped out of a mythology book. 12 Draken warriors entered through the hole where Jake's wall used to be. They wore armor that seemed to be made from crystallized starlight, glowing with an inner radiance that hurt to look at directly. Each one carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy, the kind of weapons that made everything else in the room look like toys. The lead warrior was female, with copper-colored scales that gleamed in the emergency lighting. She was slightly smaller than Vec had been, but she moved with a deadly grace that suggested she could take apart everyone in this room without breaking a sweat. Her helmet retracted into her armor with a hiss of hydraulics, revealing a scarred face with eyes that burned like molten gold. By order of Emperor Vec the Eternal, Sovereign of the Scorched Rim, Lord Commander of the 1700 Worlds, and Protector of the Draken Ascendancy, her voice rang out like a bell, you will step away from the human. Immediately. The Galactic Authority enforcers froze. Jake could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. They were heavily armed and well-trained, sure. But they were facing Draken Imperial Guards, warriors who had conquered entire solar systems. This wasn't even close to a fair fight. The lead enforcer's hand moved toward his weapon. This is Galactic Authority jurisdiction. You have no legal standing to interfere with an official detention. The Draken commander smiled, showing rows of very sharp teeth. Legal standing? We are the Draken Ascendancy. We do not require your permission to protect what belongs to us. She produced a holographic seal that projected into the air, filling the ruined bar with crimson light. It showed symbols that even Jake recognized as the Imperial crest. Jake Morrison is under the personal protection of the Emperor himself. He carries the status of Imperial Friend, a designation that has not been granted to any being outside our species in over 200 years. Her voice dropped to something dangerous. Any threat to him is considered a direct threat to the Ascendancy. Any harm done to him will be answered with the full might of our fleets. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Jake, huddled behind his bar, understood what that meant. The Draken Ascendancy controlled thousands of worlds and commanded military forces that made most civilizations look like children playing with sticks. They just declared that touching Jake would start a war. The Bulldog Enforcer's face had gone from gray to almost white. This is insane. He's just a bartender. One human. You'd risk interstellar conflict over. Choose your next words very carefully, the commander interrupted. You are speaking about someone the Emperor considers a friend. Think long and hard about whether your authority wants to test our resolve on this matter. The lead enforcer's jaw clenched so hard Jake could hear his teeth grinding from across the room. But he wasn't stupid. Whatever they wanted with Jake, it wasn't worth fighting the Draken Empire over. He raised a hand, signaling his team to stand down. The authority will remember this interference, he said coldly, staring at Jake with pure hatred. This isn't over, human. Not by a long shot. Then I suggest you file a formal complaint through proper diplomatic channels, the commander replied sweetly. I'm sure the Emperor would love to discuss why your authority was attempting to illegally detain his personal friend without charges, without representation, and without evidence of wrongdoing. The enforcers and their Koth muscled back toward the door, never taking their eyes off the Draken warriors. When they finally left, the tension in the room dropped by half. Jake slowly stood up from behind his ruined bar, brushing dust and debris from his hair. His hands were shaking. The Draken commander approached him, and up close she was even more intimidating. She could have snapped him like a twig. Instead she bowed. Actually bowed. And her 11 warriors followed suit. Forgive the dramatic entrance and the damage to your establishment, Jake Morrison. I am Commander Raya of the Imperial Guard. Emperor Vec learned that the Galactic Authority had marked you for detention. He sent us to ensure your safety. Jake looked at the massive hole in his wall, at the destroyed tables and broken glass everywhere. He's really an emperor? Like ruling planet's emperor? 1,700 worlds across 3 galactic arms, Raya confirmed. And you, somehow, managed to do what no one has done in 3 centuries. You made him feel like a normal person. He speaks very highly of your whiskey and your kindness. The journey to the Draken homeworld took almost a week aboard a ship that Jake's brain couldn't even fully comprehend. It wasn't just big. Big didn't cover it. The Imperial Dreadnought was the size of a small city, with corridors that stretched for miles and ceilings so high they had their own weather systems. Jake had been given quarters that were bigger than his entire bar back on New Denver Station. The bathroom alone was the size of his old apartment. Commander Raya had tried to prepare him for what was coming. She spent hours teaching him about Draken culture, proper etiquette, and the political minefield he was about to walk into. There were 7 different types of bows, each with specific meanings. There were titles that went on for full minutes. There were rules about eye contact, hand gestures, even how you were supposed to breathe in the Emperor's presence. Jake's head was spinning. I'm just a bartender, Raya. I pour drinks and listen to people's problems. I don't know how to do any of this fancy political stuff. Raya had looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. That is precisely why the Emperor wants you there. Everyone else knows the games. You do not. That makes you valuable. Now, standing on the observation deck as the ship approached Pyraxis, Jake understood he was way out of his depth. The planet below was like nothing he'd ever imagined. Massive volcanic mountain ranges stretched across continents, their peaks glowing with rivers of lava that flowed like veins of fire. Cities made of black crystal and red stone sprawled across the landscape, each one larger than any human city Jake had ever seen. And circling the planet were rings of orbital stations and defensive platforms that looked like they could take on entire fleets. 6 billion Draken live on the surface, Raya said, standing beside him. Another 2 billion in the orbital habitats. This is the heart of the ascendancy. The center of everything. The ship descended toward the largest volcano Jake had ever seen. It had to be 100 miles across, maybe more. And rising from the center of the massive caldera was a structure that took Jake's breath away. The imperial palace looked like someone had carved a cathedral out of ruby the size of a mountain. Spires reached toward the sky, each one covered in intricate carvings that glowed with internal light. Bridges of crystal connected towers that floated impossibly in midair. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. "Holy hell," Jake whispered. "Indeed," Raya agreed. "Try not to say that in front of the nobles though. They tend to be sensitive about crude language." The ship landed on a private platform halfway up the palace. Jake was given formal clothes to wear, nothing too fancy but nicer than anything he'd owned before. Dark pants, a jacket with subtle embroidery, boots that were probably worth more than his entire wardrobe back home. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the guy staring back. "Remember," Raya said as they prepared to leave the ship, "the throne room will be full of nobles, advisors, military commanders and various hangers-on. They will all be watching you, judging you, trying to figure out what advantage they can gain from your presence. Do not let them intimidate you." "Too late for that," Jake muttered. The walk through the palace was overwhelming. Hallways of polished obsidian reflected light from flowing lava channels built into the walls. Servants and guards bowed as they passed, though Jake was pretty sure they were bowing to Raya, not him. They passed through doors that were 30 feet tall, walked across bridges that spanned gaps filled with glowing magma, and climbed staircases that seemed to go on forever. Finally, they reached a set of massive doors covered in gold and precious stones. 2 guards, each one bigger than any Draken Jake had seen so far, pushed the doors open. The throne room beyond was impossible. That was the only word for it. The ceiling was so high Jake couldn't see it through the haze of heat and light. Pillars the size of skyscrapers held up archways carved with scenes of battles and victories stretching back thousands of years. And filling every inch of available space were Draken nobles in robes of every color imaginable. There had to be hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all turning to look as Jake entered. The whispers started immediately. Jake couldn't understand the language, but he didn't need to. He knew they were talking about him. The human. The primitive species that had barely made it off their own planet. What was he doing here? Why was the Emperor giving him any attention at all? An announcer's voice boomed through the chamber, speaking in Draken first and then translating to Common. "Jake Morrison of Earth, guest of the Emperor, bearer of imperial friendship, protected under the personal seal of Vec the Eternal." The walk to the throne felt like it took an hour. Jake was acutely aware of every eye on him, every whisper, every judgmental stare. His boots clicked on the polished stone floor, the sound echoing embarrassingly loud in the vast space. And at the far end of the throne room, sitting on a seat carved from what looked like a single massive diamond, was Vec. He looked completely different from the lonely figure who had sat at Jake's bar 3 weeks ago. Here, Vec was draped in robes of deep crimson and midnight blue, worked with threads of gold and platinum. A crown of actual fire floated above his horns, casting dancing shadows across his face. He sat with perfect posture, radiating authority and power in a way that made Jake want to bow just from instinct. But then their eyes met across that vast distance, and Jake saw something flicker in Vec's expression. Relief maybe. Or happiness. Something real beneath all the ceremony. Jake reached the base of the throne and attempted the formal bow that Raya had taught him. He was pretty sure he messed it up, holding it too long or not long enough or something, but he tried his best. "Rise, Jake Morrison." Vec's voice carried through the chamber with that same authority Jake had heard in the announcement. "We are pleased that you have accepted our invitation to the Imperial homeworld." The formal words felt wrong after the easy conversation they'd had at the bar. Jake straightened up and looked at Vec, really looked at him, trying to see past the crown and the robes and the throne. Screw it, Jake thought. If they're going to kick me out, might as well be for being myself. "Thanks for the ride, Vec," Jake said in his normal voice, not the formal tone everyone else was using. "This place is incredible. Though I gotta say it's a bit much. You could fit about 1,000 of my bars in this room alone." The throne room went dead silent. Jake heard someone gasp. Another noble made a choking sound. Apparently, addressing the Emperor casually and making jokes about his palace wasn't proper etiquette. Who knew? But Vec's face transformed. The imperial mask cracked, and underneath was a genuine smile, the same one Jake had seen that night when they talked about whiskey and loneliness and the general absurdity of existence. Vec laughed, a warm, rich sound that seemed to surprise everyone in the room. "Indeed, old friend. Though your establishment had a charm that this palace lacks. Intimacy. Honest conversation. Good whiskey without the weight of ceremony. Vec stood from his throne, descending the steps with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Walk with me. We have much to discuss, and I grow weary of formality. The nobles looked like they'd been slapped. The emperor didn't just leave throne room audiences. There were protocols, procedures, proper ways to end these things. But Vec was already moving toward a side entrance, and Jake hurried to follow. They emerged onto a balcony that overlooked the capital city. The view was breathtaking. Lava flows wound through the streets like glowing rivers. Buildings of crystal and stone caught the light and threw it back in a million colors. In the distance, other volcanoes rumbled and smoked, adding to the dramatic landscape. Raya and a few guards followed but kept their distance, giving Vec and Jake space to talk. For a moment they just stood there looking out at the city. I apologize for all the ceremony, Vec said quietly, the formal tone completely gone now. The court expects certain things. If I had my way, we would have met in a bar somewhere quiet. Why didn't you tell me? Jake asked. That night, you could have mentioned you were, the Emperor of 1700 worlds. Vec's expression turned sad. Because the moment I tell someone who I am, everything changes. They stop seeing me and start seeing the crown. They calculate angles and advantages. They measure every word, looking for ways to gain favor or avoid offense. He looked at Jake. You treated me like a person. Just a tired person who needed a drink and someone to talk to. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Jake thought about it. I guess I can see that. Everyone wanting something from you all the time. Never knowing if people actually like you or just like what you can do for them. Precisely. For 300 years I have ruled. 300 years of decisions and responsibilities and the weight of billions of lives depending on my choices. I took those weeks to travel alone because I needed to remember what it felt like to be just Vec, not Emperor Vec the Eternal. He turned to Jake with those ancient golden eyes. In your bar for 2 hours I was just Vec. You have no idea what a gift that was. Jake leaned against the railing processing all this. So what happens now? I'm guessing you didn't bring me all the way out here just to say thanks. I have a proposal, Vec said carefully. Stay here. Be my advisor and friend. Help me remember what it means to connect with beings without politics and power games getting in the way. He hesitated, and Jake could see actual vulnerability in his expression. I need someone who will tell me the truth. Someone who wants nothing from me except honest conversation. Be that person. Please. Jake looked out at the alien city, thinking about his destroyed bar back on New Denver Station, thinking about the Galactic Authority threats, thinking about how completely insane his life had become in just 3 weeks. I'm not qualified for this, Vec. I don't know anything about running an empire or politics or any of that stuff. Jake had been living in the Imperial Palace for 3 months now, and somehow he'd managed to not completely embarrass himself or cause an interstellar incident. Well, not a major one anyway. There was that time he accidentally insulted a visiting diplomat by using the wrong hand gesture, but Vec had smoothed that over with surprising patience. True to his word, Vec had commissioned a bar for Jake. Not just any bar though. The Emperor had given him an entire wing of the palace, a space so large Jake could have fit 10 of his old establishments inside it. The construction had taken 6 weeks, with craftsmen importing rare woods from a dozen different worlds. The bar itself was carved from a single piece of timber from a tree that only grew on one planet in the outer rim, its grains swirling with natural patterns that looked almost alive. Jake had named it the Wanderer's Return, a nod to both his old place and this crazy journey he'd found himself on. And he'd insisted on running it exactly like he'd run the last stop back home. No special treatment for nobles. No reserved sections for the powerful. Everyone paid for their drinks, including the Emperor himself. If you wanted to sit at Jake's bar, you checked your titles and your weapons at the door. The Draken nobles had been scandalized at first. An emperor drinking alongside common merchants? Scientists sitting next to military officers? The whole idea went against centuries of careful social hierarchy. But Vec had made it clear that anyone who wanted informal time with him could find him at Jake's bar 3 evenings a week, and that was that. The results had been surprising. Without the formal pressure of the throne room, people actually talked. Really talked. A shipping merchant mentioned supply problems that the trade ministry had been ignoring for months. A young scientist shared research that had been buried by bureaucrats who didn't want to admit their older theories were wrong. Military officers spoke honestly about troop morale instead of giving the polished reports they presented in official meetings. Jake didn't offer solutions. He wasn't qualified for that. But he asked questions. Simple questions that somehow no one else thought to ask. Why hasn't anyone told the Emperor about this before? Or, what do the people actually doing the work think? Or, have you tried just asking them directly? Vec valued those questions more than all the complex political analysis his official advisors provided. He'd started bringing problems to Jake, not for answers but for perspective. And somehow that human perspective, uncluttered by Draken politics and traditions, helped Vec see things differently. Jake was reviewing inventory for the bar, trying to figure out why they were going through so much of a particular Vrelnari wine, when Commander Raya entered. Her expression was serious, the kind of serious that meant bad news was coming. "We have a situation," she said without preamble. "The outer colonies are in revolt." Jake set down his datapad. Revolt? Like fighting revolt? Not yet, but close. Raya activated a holographic display showing 6 star systems on the edge of Draken space. These colonies have declared independence. They're demanding self-governance, representation, the right to make their own decisions without imperial oversight. "Okay," Jake said slowly. "I mean, that doesn't sound completely unreasonable. What do they want exactly?" Raya looked uncomfortable. "They're quoting you, Jake. They're calling it the Morrison Principle. The idea that every being deserves respect regardless of rank or species, that friendship and honest dealing matter more than hierarchical power structures." Jake felt his stomach drop. "What? I never told anyone to start a revolution." "You didn't have to. You befriended an emperor as an equal. That one act challenged 300 years of imperial tradition." She brought up footage of protests on a colonial world. Thousands of beings, dozens of different species, carrying banners with phrases Jake vaguely remembered saying during casual conversations at the bar. "Respect over rank," one banner read. "Question authority that doesn't serve the people," said another. "The Morrison Principle, everyone deserves a voice." "Oh no," Jake whispered. "This is bad. This is really bad." The door opened and Vec entered, and for the first time since Jake had known him, the Emperor looked genuinely uncertain. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "I need your counsel, old friend," Vec said quietly. "The Imperial Council is demanding immediate military intervention. They say if we allow these colonies to break away, the entire empire will fracture. World after world will declare independence until there's nothing left." "What do you want to do?" Jake asked. "I don't know." Vec sat heavily on one of the bar stools, his wings drooping. "The Emperor in me sees the threat. Empires that show weakness don't survive. But the person you helped me remember asks a different question. Are they wrong? These colonies were conquered generations ago. Their grandparents never had a choice about joining the ascendancy. Why shouldn't they have a say in their own governance?" Raya looked shocked. "Your Majesty, you can't seriously be considering letting them go. The military implications alone." "I know the implications, Commander," Vec interrupted. "I've spent 3 centuries building and maintaining this empire. But Jake has made me question whether maintaining power is the same as doing what's right." Over the next several hours, representatives from the rebellious colonies arrived. Not as prisoners or enemies but as invited guests. Vec had shocked his entire council by reaching out directly, offering to talk before sending in warships. The council had argued, threatened, practically begged him to reconsider, but Vec had been firm. Jake kept the bar open and the drinks flowing as Draken nobles, military commanders and colony representatives gathered in this unlikely space. The atmosphere was tense, everyone watching everyone else, hands twitching toward weapons that weren't there because Jake's rules applied to everyone. A female Vrelnari named Lissa spoke first. She was small compared to the Draken around her, but her 4 eyes blazed with determination. "Emperor Vec, we don't reject the ascendancy itself. We reject being treated like children who can't be trusted with their own futures. Jake Morrison, a human who's been here 3 months, has more influence at your court than colony representatives who've served loyally for decades." "No offense to Jake." "None taken," Jake said quietly. "She's got a point." Vec's claws tapped against his glass, a habit Jake had learned meant he was thinking hard. "Continue." A Koth representative, a grizzled old warrior named Drex, stood next. "My people fought alongside yours in the boundary wars. We bled for the ascendancy. But when we ask for infrastructure improvements or trade considerations, we're told to be patient, to wait our turn, to trust that the Empire knows what's best for us." His voice was heavy with frustration. "We're tired of waiting. We're tired of being told what we need instead of being asked." Jake poured drinks for the speakers, listening. More representatives shared similar stories. Not of oppression exactly, but of being ignored. Of having no real voice in decisions that affected their worlds. of being part of an empire that took their resources and loyalty but gave them no seat at the table. Finally, a young Draken noble named Thex stood, his scales an unusual shade of green. "If I may speak, Your Majesty. I've been studying human history, specifically their governmental systems. They had something called democracy, where citizens voted on their leaders and laws. It was messy and slow and inefficient." He paused. "But it gave people ownership of their society. They felt heard. They felt valued." The older nobles hissed at this. Democracy? The idea was absurd. How could common beings possibly know what was best for themselves? They needed guidance, leadership, order. Jake couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Can I say something?" The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at the human bartender who'd somehow become the center of this political crisis. "I'm nobody special," Jake said, his voice steady despite his nerves. 3 months ago I was running a dive bar on a space station. I'm not a politician or a philosopher or whatever. But I've spent years listening to people talk. All kinds of people. And you know what I've learned? People don't need you to make all their decisions for them. They just want to be heard. They want to know their concerns matter." He looked at Vec. "You asked me to help you remember what it's like to connect with beings without all the power games. Well, here's my perspective. These colonies aren't rebelling because they hate the ascendancy. They're rebelling because they feel invisible. They feel like they could disappear tomorrow and nobody at the top would notice or care." Jake turned to address the whole room. "Back on Earth, we had this saying, no taxation without representation. It started a whole revolution because people were tired of being ruled by someone who didn't listen to them. That's what's happening here. These colonies don't want to fight you, Vec. They want you to actually hear them." Lissa nodded vigorously. "Exactly. We're not asking to break away. We're asking for a seat at the table. A real one where our voices actually matter." Vec stood slowly, his massive frame dominating the room. "What if I offered you that seat? Not as a gesture or a token but as actual power. A colonial assembly with real legislative authority. Representatives elected by your worlds, with the ability to propose laws, challenge imperial decisions, and have a genuine say in how the ascendancy is governed." The imperial nobles erupted in protests. "You can't give away the throne's authority. This will weaken everything we've built. The common beings aren't qualified to govern." But Vec raised a hand for silence. "For 300 years I've ruled through strength and tradition. I built an empire, yes. But Jake has shown me something I'd forgotten. Friendship built on mutual respect lasts far longer than dominance built on fear." 6 months had passed since the colonial assembly was formed, and the galaxy was still trying to figure out what it meant. The mighty Draken ascendancy, an empire that had conquered worlds through military might and ruled with an iron fist for centuries, had voluntarily shared power with its colonies. Political analysts across a dozen civilizations were calling it unprecedented, revolutionary, and possibly suicidal depending on who you asked. Jake's bar had become something of a legend now. Beings traveled from across the ascendancy just to say they'd had a drink at the place where an emperor learned to listen. The waiting list for a table was 3 weeks long, though Jake still kept a few spots open for walk-ins because he hated the idea of turning away someone who might really need a friendly ear. The Colonial Assembly had its first session 2 months ago, and it had been chaos. Representatives from 70 different colony worlds, all with their own grievances and agendas, trying to agree on literally anything. The first week had been nothing but arguments about what color the official seal should be. But slowly, painfully, they were learning to work together. They'd passed their first piece of legislation last week, a trade reform bill that actually seemed to help small merchants instead of just the big corporations. Vec attended every session, sitting quietly in the back and listening. He rarely spoke, but when he did, people paid attention. Jake had watched the Emperor's whole demeanor change over these months. He seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted that he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. But not everyone was happy about the changes. Jake was cleaning glasses one evening when Raya rushed into the bar, her scales bristling with agitation. "We have a serious problem. The Galactic Authority is mobilizing fleets on our border." Jake set down the glass carefully. "How serious are we talking?" 40 warships serious. They're calling it a training exercise, but our intelligence says they're testing our defenses. Raya pulled up a holographic map showing the border regions. "They think the reforms have made us weak. They're probing to see if we'll fold." Vec arrived moments later, still wearing his formal court robes from an assembly session. He looked tired but alert. "How many ships can we have at the border within 12 hours? 200, Raya said immediately. "But the council is recommending a full mobilization." Show overwhelming force. Remind the authority why they should fear us. No, Vex said firmly. 200 is enough to defend. More than that looks like we're preparing to invade. He turned to Jake. What do you think? Jake blinked. Me? I don't know anything about military strategy. You know about sending messages. What message do we want to send here? Jake thought about it, pouring himself a drink to help him think. They're testing you, right? Seeing if being nice to your colonies made you soft. So you need to show them you're not weak, but you also don't want to start an actual war over a dick measuring contest. Vex's mouth twitched into a smile. Eloquently put. Continue. Send your ships. Defend the border. But maybe also send a message to the authority leadership. Something like, hey, we noticed your training exercise. We're running 1-2 same area. Hope that's cool. Want to grab a drink after and talk about not accidentally starting a war. Raya looked scandalized. You can't just invite them for drinks during a military standoff. Why not? Jake shrugged. Either they're actually planning to attack, in which case they'll say no and you know to prepare for real trouble. Or they're just posturing and you're calling their bluff while offering them a way to back down without looking weak. Vec considered this for a long moment. Then he started laughing, that deep rumbling sound that made the glasses on the bar rattle. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Raya, deploy our forces to defensive positions. And send a message to Authority High Command. Tell them Emperor Vec invites them to discuss mutual security concerns over drinks at the Imperial Palace. Tell them my human friend makes excellent whiskey and we're all civilized beings who can talk instead of shooting at each other. 3 days later, to everyone's absolute shock, the Authority accepted. A delegation of 5 arrived aboard a diplomatic vessel, led by Chancellor Nexus himself, the same official who tried to have Jake arrested months ago. The meeting was held at Jake's bar, neutral ground where titles meant nothing and everyone followed the same rules. Nexus and his delegation sat on one side of a large table. Vex sat on the other, with Jake serving drinks and Raya standing nearby looking like she wanted to shoot someone. The first hour was tense, full of diplomatic language and veiled threats. The Authority claimed they were concerned about instability in the Ascendancy. Vec countered that internal reforms were not the Authority's business. Around and around they went, making no progress. Finally, Jake had enough. He slammed a bottle down on the table, making everyone jump. Okay, time out. This is stupid. He poured drinks for everyone whether they wanted them or not. You're all dancing around the real issue. Chancellor, you're scared that if the Ascendancy can reform and become more democratic, other empires might have to do the same. That threatens your power structure. And Vec, you're worried that showing any uncertainty makes you look weak. So you're both posturing instead of actually talking. Nexus's crystalline form flickered with what might have been anger. You overstep, human. These are complex political matters that what? That I'm too dumb to understand? Jake interrupted. Maybe. But I understand that you're all so busy playing games that you're missing the obvious solution. You don't have to fight each other. There's enough galaxy for everyone. One of the Authority delegates, a reptilian being named SSRWAX, leaned forward. The human makes a point. Our concern is not the Ascendancy's strength. It's the precedent. If colonies can demand representation, if empires can reform without collapsing, what does that mean for the established order? It means things change, Vex said simply. They always do. The question is whether we change willingly or get dragged into it kicking and screaming. I chose to change because a human bartender reminded me what I'd forgotten. That power without purpose is just tyranny with a prettier name. The conversation shifted after that. Not to friendship exactly, but to something more honest. The Authority admitted they were struggling with their own colonial unrest. Vex shared what was working with the Assembly and what wasn't. They talked about trade agreements, security cooperation, ways they could both benefit without either side losing face. It wasn't a perfect solution. There would still be tensions, still be conflicts down the road. But it was a start. And it came from a human bartender telling some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy to stop being idiots and actually talk to each other. The delegation left the next day, and the border crisis quietly dissolved. The Authority fleets returned to their normal patrols. The Ascendancy stood down from high alert. And across the galaxy, analysts tried to figure out how a simple human had prevented a war by serving whiskey and calling out bullshit. 2 weeks later, Jake stood on his favorite balcony with Vec, watching the sun set over the capital city. The lava flows caught the fading light and turned everything golden and red. Do you ever regret it? Jake asked. All the changes, all the complications I brought into your life? Vec was quiet for a long moment, his golden eyes reflecting the sunset. For 300 years I ruled alone. I was powerful, feared, respected. But I was profoundly, desperately alone. Every conversation was calculated. Every relationship was transactional. Every moment carried the weight of the crown. He turned to look at Jake. Then one night, in a small bar on a nothing station, someone treated me like a person. Not an emperor. Not a symbol. Just a tired being who needed a drink and some kindness. That one simple act changed everything. I just poured you a whiskey, Jake protested. No. You saw me. The real me, underneath all the power and ceremony. You reminded me that connection matters more than control, that friendship built on honesty lasts longer than alliances built on fear. Beck smiled. You gave me back something I'd lost. Hope. Hope that beings can be better, that power doesn't have to corrupt, that change is possible. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. The authority still doesn't trust me. Half your nobles think I'm manipulating you. Those colonies might still cause trouble. Perhaps. Change is messy and complicated, and sometimes it all goes wrong. Vec placed a massive claw gently on Jake's shoulder. But stagnation is death. You showed me that. A human bartender with no political training, no grand ambitions, just basic decency and common sense. You proved wiser than 3 centuries of imperial advisors. Speaking of which, Jake said with a grin, you still haven't paid your bar tab. It's getting pretty high. Vec laughed so hard that windows rattled across the palace. Add it to the list of things I owe you, old friend. My gratitude, my friendship, and my acknowledgement that humanity's greatest strength isn't your technology or your weapons. It's your stubborn insistence on treating others with basic respect, even when it's inconvenient. That evening, Jake's bar was packed as usual. Colonial representatives debated policy with imperial nobles. Merchants traded stories with scientists. Soldiers played cards with artists. And in the back corner, an emperor sat with his friend, his crown set aside, just 2 beings sharing a drink and honest conversation. The galactic authority would eventually adapt to the new normal. The colonial assembly would face challenges and triumphs, victories and setbacks. The ascendancy would continue evolving, sometimes painfully, into something unprecedented in galactic history, an empire governed by both strength and compassion. But in this moment, in this bar built on the principle that everyone deserves kindness and a listening ear, Jake Morrison tended his counter and realized something profound. Humanity hadn't conquered the galaxy through superior weapons or brilliant strategy. They'd changed it through something much simpler and infinitely more powerful. One human had seen loneliness in another being and responded with compassion. That single act of basic human decency had rippled outward, reforming an empire, preventing a war, and proving that sometimes the most revolutionary force in the universe isn't violence or technology or political genius. Sometimes it's just kindness. Simple, honest, unconditional kindness. And sometimes all it takes to change the universe is one drink shared with someone who needed it, one conversation that sees the person instead of the power, one moment of genuine connection in a galaxy too often ruled by calculation and fear. Jake raised his glass in a silent toast to that truth, to unlikely friendships, and to the idea that maybe, just maybe, treating each other decently could actually make things better. The galaxy was still learning that lesson. But thanks to a bartender who poured a drink for a lonely dragon, it was finally starting to understand.